Greetings and welcome to everyone to another episode of Signs, Planets, and Stellar Rhythms. This is the sixth episode in this series, and this particular episode is going to be focused on one large subject, and would be Mars in Aries. So it's going to be a little bit shorter in this episode as we're going to be focusing solely on this, and it's really part of episode 5, which I mentioned Mars and Aries in that episode, along with a lot of other activity going on in June of this year, 2020. And this, of course, the focus is on the astrology and the night sky, and what's going on in that connection between those two things and how that plays a role in our own lives. And so here I'm going to share with you today all that what we're going to really go into this next phase of the theme of 2020 and how that moves, influences our lives, how we can fully participate in that dynamic and take advantage of those opportunities. Yes, and here we are. So I'm your host, Erik Roth, Shamanic Astrologer, and I'm excited to bring this particular subject to YouTube, to everyone that's interested in what Mars represents and this upcoming 6.5-month transit of Mars in the sign of Aries. So it's a really exciting process, a transit that's happening here, and elevating the situation that we have with Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter in the area of Capricorn and Aquarius, and how that has been playing a significant role in the crisis that we've been experiencing that has been multi-layered and really creating so much movement and activity in the world that it's pretty remarkable just to be alive in this time, and at the same time scary and amazing and just wild. So let's take a look at what we're, again, the bullet points of what we're talking about here. Mars and Aries, the Mars aspects of Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, and Eris. I'll go into some detail about that, especially around the dates. And then the Mars opposition point, which is going to be with the how we measure the Mars cycle, and this was with the Sun. Now, first, for those that are new to astrology and shamanic astrology in particular, just to describe what Mars represents in shamanic astrology and even in general, I can kind of correlate that in this presentation. So just to give you some foundation about where her Mars is and what we're looking at here, this is just a screen capture of how, a graphical representation of the solar system. This is as of June 27th. Now, right now, at the time of this recording, 10 days earlier, you can see all this cluster of all the planets, all the visible planets are all kind of hanging out together, at least from a heliocentric perspective, from if you were to say, be orbiting between Mercury and the Sun and being able to see all the planets kind of clustered in together. But from Earth's perspective, we look in one direction and we can see Saturn and Jupiter, and even with the telescope Pluto, we can see all those planets clustered together from that view. But if we see on the other side, we can see Mercury and Venus from one side of the Sun, and then on the other side, Mars and even Ceres over here. And then way out here is Neptune. Uranus is a bit even on the other side, I believe on the right side of the screen, kind of cut off there a bit. So yes, this is really interesting for us to connect with, and for visual references. There is just so much to see in both the morning sky and the evening sky this year. So feel free to definitely take advantage of it. And if it's better weather and better viewing on the horizon and the southern part of the sky, it's just incredible to witness the brightening of these planets. So let's take a look at what Mars means in shamanic astrology. This is a big topic here. So fourth planet from the sun. So in shamanic astrology, Mars represents the masculine principle. So it differs from traditional astrology in that they relate that more into kind of the martial qualities, uh, action, events, intuition, and really that can show up strongly in just in the basic Mars definition, but on a personal chart, on a chart that, or in your own life within each individual, Mars represents a masculine principle within, or what Jungians would call the animus, especially for those that are women, that projected other. But for everyone, really, it's that masculine side, and our relationship to the masculine even has some relationship to the patriarchy, the patriarchal sort of culture that we have across the globe. That's part of that experience. So, but it's done without judgment here in shamanic astrology. So Mars is looked at as neither good nor bad. It's seen as what we call progressive part. That means it's an emerging quality. So moving our soul forward in our life about what we're connected with when it comes to our relationship to the masculine. And then it's considered to be a personal planet. So it's not something that is represents what we call strategy, or, a larger, cultural level or a civilization level when it comes to, each person. Mars represents on a more personal level, but there is a part of Mars, like if we were talking about nations, communities, and cultures, then Mars can connect on that level as well, on a more collective level. So Mars archetypes, there's 12, just as there's 12 Venus archetypes. And that I relate archetype to signs. So they're, in my mind, in my practice, they're interchangeable. The natal Mars sign is the most important factor when defining the role of the masculine in a person's life. So there are 12 major masculine, quote, types. And I say that loosely because an archetype or a sign is in its most, in the most strict definition, cannot truly be defined, because when we look at image itself, or a picture, a photo, how do we fully define that and just say a sentence? Certainly you can see maybe an action, a situation occurring, but then when we go even deeper, there's so much contained or content in that, and that content can evolve depending on one's perception over periods of time. So, and then prior to the Greco-Roman eras, Mars was known by many other names around the world, and wasn't necessarily, quote, a war god, but was much more dynamic and expansive in its expression, astrologically speaking. For the majority of human history, there were no professional soldiers, at least year-round. There were, of course, wars fought, but they would be part-time. They would come in times where emergencies happened or crises happened, and then people would be called to gear up to defend their land, or to, in some leaders' cases, maybe try to take the land from others as well. So Mars has, the sign of Aries in particular has a long history of that, with that particular type of what part of astrology that comes into play. All right, this next slide here is just and you can, for those who are watching it, if you wanted to pause it and to be able to read this, this is just a table of, this is just a table of Mars in a particular phase of Mars's cycle. And so these are various dates where Mars has an aspect. That means an aspect meaning some relationship with it that we can, more easily determine. Like, for example, if it's conjunct a planet or a moon or the sun, or if it's on the opposite side of the sky with another object, or if it's maybe halfway between one side of the sky or the other side with an object, and that would be related to a square, an L-shaped. So these are the dates. Now, the cycle, the cycle begins um, in on October 14th, 2020. Down here on the bottom, I list 2018 because that was the last time it had a really a bright period, just about 2 years ago, when it just was in a low part of the sky here in the northern hemisphere. But in 2020, it's going to be almost as bright as it was in 2018 and be a little more visible, at least higher in the sky for most to see here in the northern hemisphere. Of course, it'll definitely be highly visible as well in the southern hemisphere. So just because I live up here in Oregon, I come from the perspective of where I am in the geographical location here. But all of these things, all of these dates are really important. And it's not just specifically these dates, that these 1 days that things happen. It's just that it opens up a period of time. So from a shamanic perspective, it's a window, it's a period of time, a duration, if you will, when Mars might be close, or the moon might be close to Mars, or Mars and Saturn might be square, or back in February, March, and early April, Mars was moving into Capricorn, and I talk about this in the one of my first videos that I've done, the Capricorn stellium. And I definitely refer you to that video around that particular period of time and the crisis that's been unfolding here. Really, because it points to this next, you might say, hand moving into the next part of the clock that is highly significant. Maybe the top of the hour, the bottom of the hour, those major points on the clock. So let's take a look at what Mars in Aries represents. This is the incubation of the masculine. So this Aries, so when we, in traditional astrology, they may say Mars rules Aries. So in shamanic astrology, we look at this as a resonance. So we try to get away from the language of rulership, but they basically mean the same thing. They have very similar connotations as far as the essence is concerned. There's definitely a major relationship between the sign/archetype of Aries and the planet Mars. Aries' essence, the sign of Aries, his essence is about mission orientation. It is an actional and rugged independence. Can be likened to the guardian of the cosmic order. So it's all about finding mission and purpose. And for Aries, it's definitely an instinctual process of finding something that calls to them, and then they go for it. And Aries can be really honed in and really good at that experience. It's a fire element. It's fast moving, willful, strong of mind and strong of body as a force. And it usually uses its martial skills to overcome obstacles, or then sometimes willpower. Like all signs of the zodiac, over long periods of time, as I mentioned, kind of alluded to this, Aries has been violated and corrupted as a sign, like it's been, you might say, kidnapped and made to serve a particular purpose in culture. In this case, professional soldiers for the most part. Although there are a lot of other aspects of it in today's world. It isn't just that soldier quality. Like, for example, Doctors Without Borders, Habitat for Humanity, Mercy Corps, these organizations that are out there that contain people that connect with that essence of wanting to fulfill a mission and purpose to serve humanity in a more beneficial way, rather than carrying a gun and going into battle, as far as following orders, depending on the meaning behind whatever war that might be or whatever battle that might be. There's, of course, many different layers there. In fact, I would recommend for everyone that is interested in the history of the patriarchy and war is a book called A Terrible Love of War by James Hillman. And that is from a Jungian psychological perspective. And it's just a brilliant book. And it's actually in some ways heartbreaking to see humanity's love of this action that we as individuals, as cultures, can choose perhaps another way of solving our problems rather than going to battle. Now, obviously, in extreme emergencies, maybe that is the last resort, but to want to exhaust all other options on the table first. Aries is championed also at the same time by the ultimate and fiercest warrior of, that this is a good thing. Warriors are shown in entertainment mediums today as the ultimate good. So it's like the hero archetype, which is why I have this picture of Captain America here. It's like the symbol of like, hey, this is the most ideal, you know, fundamental version of what Aries can represent in a you know, as a warrior quote, in at least in from a entertaining and archetypal way. It's kind of a profound, and I, even as a kid in the 80s, a teenager, I did read comic books, and Captain America was one of those. I found him fascinating, and it's interesting to see him expressed in movies today. But more on this. Aries is the martial symbol of the 12 signs, and this symbol, as I shared with you a lot already, this quality has been utilized in a wide variety of ways, but mostly in mainstream, mostly associated with battle and war and the heroic efforts. And it has had an incredibly profound impact on in the world stage, for many thousands of years. And there were many other gods associated with this, but there was other expressions of these gods that also went into fulfilling missions or overcoming obstacles or solving problems or attending to the land as farmers. These things that Aries also can show up very strongly in this world and in history. Now, it depends on where Mars would be, and it shows up through that expression. But Mars can make from connect with the masculine for any sign of the zodiac. And if it's say it's connected with another sign that is more creative and slower paced, like for example Taurus, then it would definitely be shown up in a very different way than what Aries would be. Just first in line, a velocity seeker, a defender of the cosmic order, ready to volunteer to uh, capture the capital, or to be there at the guardian of the threshold to make sure that the families and the communities are protected, and to rescue them in some fashion. It's certainly in the romantic age, with the romanticism of the hero warrior rescuing the princess. I mean, Aries is definitely was strongly captivated and captured into that role, which is, we know, fairly, I mean, really limited dimensionally version of how Aries can show up. There is so much more in that space. So it's intimate and deeply connected with the feminine as well, and can't really be truly defined without it. There's, of course, a lot of stories that involve Mars and Venus, and the connection with the masculine and feminine, and the idealisms we place, projected idealisms we place in what we might see as a stereotype masculine or stereotype feminine. So Mars has a big role there. In Mars and Aries, I bring up this particular, I'm switching gears here a little bit, because I'm going to show you some night sky images. I'm going to show you some connections of dates of Mars's aspects with different planets. And there's a particular constellation where Mars will be spending a lot of time in, and it's already, as of this date, is already moving into that space right now. And it's going to spend about over 6 months in that constellation called the Fish, what astronomers still call Pisces. But to try to differentiate signs and constellations, we're seeing that it's the Fish constellation. It's like a constellation that is knotted from the place of water where fish are jumping out of that. And this constellation has also played a role in the evolution and the beginnings of Christianity. And I'm not going to go into it too much right now. I encourage you, if you wanted to pause this a little bit, to read all of this. There's an astrologer, Emily Trinkus, who wrote this brilliant article about the constellation of the fish and even the sign of Pisces. I don't have the link to that, but once I think I may look it up and post it at the bottom of in the description of this video at some point, and give you that as a reference. But that'll give you further history around this particular constellation. Really, really fascinating, because it's not very bright, but Mars is going to be spending a lot of time in there, and so it's going to be, quote, activating this particular constellation from a process of our connection and the psyche, consciousness-wise. You know, these are things that are going to be we're going to be connected with more actively over these next 6 months. So it has a lot of stars that are in the 4 and 5 magnitude of brightness, which are really dim, and you have to really be outside the urban center to see this constellation. You can see parts of it in the suburbs depending on certain areas of your neighborhood, but I would encourage you, if you go out a little bit farther, this constellation can show up fairly easily once you do get outside that. All right, so here are here's the data around the planetary aspects, what we call dynamic aspects or hard aspects in regular Western astrology. These are conjunctions, squares, and oppositions. So first thing that's coming up here, and in my next episode, which will be in the second week of July, I will be talking about this more in detail, but there's a Mars Chiron conjunction in Aries. And Chiron is spending several years in this sign of Aries. And for those of you that were born with Chiron Aries, such as myself, I'm in a Chiron return cycle. It means I've come up to a place where Chiron has come all the way around, anywhere from 48 to 51 years. So this conjunction takes place at 9 degrees Aries. I'm going to have a sky map and showing you where Chiron is located. But that is, Chiron represents a fracture point within ourselves, and a point of where we are to get our medicine, you know, maybe to put together our medicine bundle and to understand our vulnerabilities, understand our own fracture, our own relationship with what our soul is wanting, but to overcome that, to not allow it to own us. It does have relationships, or a relationship with health as well. And I find it fascinating that it's happening at this time with Mars and Chiron, and the situation that's going on in the crisis. I feel like, especially around the masculine and the wounding that the masculine has had, as well as the feminine, and how the masculine needs to find within itself the what are the vulnerabilities around maybe the shadow of Aries, around black and white, around fighting just to fight, instead of with a purpose, instead of with something that is worth fighting for. And the wounds, especially around war and all the millions of people that have died, not just in battle, but just regular folk that from indirect casualties and holocausts and all of that. This is a really big topic, and I feel like it's vastly important to connect within your own self and how you feel in that space. Then there is Mars's Saturn squares, Pluto squares, Jupiter squares, and Eris conjunctions. Something I talked a bit about in my earlier video in, I believe it was in March, the Capricorn stellium. And feel free, on my own YouTube channel, it's still present. There's still a lot of great information to draw from that still applies now. This is just another octave of that. that process, what's coming up this summer and into the fall. And you can see most of these are in the when Mars is in Aries and those other planets are in Capricorn. There's two of them that happens in January with Mars and Saturn in Taurus Aquarius and Mars and Jupiter in Taurus Aquarius. And then with Eris, something I haven't talked much about, but Eris represents that she's the goddess of chaos and discord. But I feel like that is a projection of the patriarchy, because she was the one that caused the trouble and or supposedly caused the trouble and created the conditions for the Trojan War to occur, you know, well over 3,000 years ago. But Eris is a strong feminine will. Henry Seltzer, another astrologer, wrote a really wonderful book about the dwarf planet Eris as it represents astrology, and it's called The 10th Planet, not to be confused with Zachariah Sitchin's book, The 10th Planet, but this is something to do with specifically with astrology. And I certainly recommend, if you're interested in reading more about Eris, that is a book to maybe get some clues, some insights. But I see Eris as a strong feminine component. With that connecting with Mars and the masculine, we could have a lot of not only strong emergence of maybe a unity between the masculine and feminine, maybe a coming together, but also at the opposite, a counterpoint where there can be a lot of tension and tumultuous times that can come through because of the resistance to the desire to come together and actually forge an alliance, to forge cooperation, maybe to go on a mission together and say, hey, we can do this better in cooperation than we can apart. So that is maybe one of the transmissions that can come through between Eris and Aries, but time will tell, of course. I think that in part some of the situation with the crisis is because there is a lot of resistance out there. Some of it important resistance to have, to a process to go through to bring the message, to bring knowledge and important information out there. But also there is a shadow of that resistance, that we may be resisting our own path, our own soul speaking to us. And so that's where there can be a way for us to maybe find to give ourselves a chance to find our own reasons to grow, to realize that, wait a minute, we can't just keep blaming, we can't just keep projecting out. We've got to come together and actually move beyond where we are to heal ourselves, certainly make aware of the challenges that we're experiencing in injustice, social injustice, law enforcement issues, the breakdown of structure and health crisis. We need to bring it out, bring the shadow out. But we also need to find, like, hey, this is an opportunity to cooperate and come together and say, hey, wait a minute, we don't have to keep doing it in a violent manner. We can do it in a more cooperative manner. And that's the polar opposite of, or sign-wise, of Aries is Libra. And so it's looking to Libra for some answers in that way. Mars will be going retrograde, and this retrograde loop beginning in September. And you can see this whole constellation of the fish showing up here. Here's Chiron between 6 and 9 degrees Aries as Mars loops around. There's the knot of Alrisha, and right there, and Mars is going to be spending, again, this is where it's spending its 6.5 months, all in this space. Uranus on one side and Chiron on the other. And there was that, early conjunction as Mars comes through here, and then it's actually right down here, and then it gets up here, and then it retrogrades and gets over the ecliptic and on to, not until in January 2021, will Mars connect with the planet Uranus. So this is the setting, and this will become much more visible in August, September, October, and November. Of course, I'll be doing more videos then to, share more about this. Here is, this is another aspect of that. There's some occultations occurring between the moon and Mars. And they're not visible. There was one visible in North America earlier this year, and I'm going to show you that. But these ones are visible in other parts of the planet, mainly in the southern hemisphere. But the idea is that Mars and the moon are really, really close. So the moon will be occulting, so it'll be passing over. From our perspective, standing in or sitting on Earth, we're seeing the moon pass over Mars. So it means it's an extremely close conjunction. And these are trigger points. And this point here on August 9th is right around the point where Mars and the Sun are in opposition to each other on October 14th, which starts an entirely new synodic cycle of Mars, a 26-month process. So that is, so the early vibrations that are going to be coming through with Mars at that point. And of course, right around there is where it's going to be squaring all that Capricorn energy, Saturn and Jupiter and Pluto. So it's going to be in that, this will be a really sensitive spot that in beginning, truly beginning in July, but certainly amplified, I believe, in August through November, especially. Then we have the station retrograde point. Just before it reaches Taurus, here at 2808 Aries, Mars has gone retrograde at that point, right along the knot of the fish. This is a star point right here, and another powerful activation point. And we can see, on this map, Neptune. We can see Chiron. Chiron and Neptune and Uranus are not visible to the naked eye, but to know that you can easily spot them through software, or if you have a really powerful telescope. But it's simply connecting with the energy and looking and connecting with that constellation for your own self. And what Aries represents, you can go elsewhere to learn about Aries in your own way. And if you have Aries on your chart, or Capricorn or Cancer or Libra, this is a really sensitive time for you as well on a personal level, especially if it's in the the late teens of Capricorn, and those other signs I mentioned, Libra, Cancer, and Aries, all the way into the latter degrees of Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, and Libra. We can see at this larger map, we see the June solstice point way off the side of the map there. We see the bull and the ram and the whale constellation, otherwise known as Cetus, all in this space here. This is a really aquatic area with the fish and the whale, and then there's the water bear. It's kind of off the screen on the right side there. Here's the occultations of Mars, and you can pause it here to take a look at this. But you can see they're all happening, with the exception of this first one in February 18th. They're all happening in the 20-degree areas of either Capricorn or Aries. And so that's just signifying greater emphasis, amplification, triggers of this area of these archetypes becoming more prominent. Mars in Aries does not necessarily mean that, oh my gosh, we're going to go to war, or there's going to be a major battle, or, I mean, there is always that possibility in this kind of, because it creates greater intensity in the world. It definitely creates more pressure and stressors, but it also creates some opportunities for us to connect with that and look at our own reactions, and maybe, especially when it gets retrograde, maybe to slow down and go and look backwards, look behind us and go, what was happening before? And especially for society, for humanity, to look back and go, hey, when we did this before, how many problems did it really solve? Did it create more? Could we have done it in a different way? Certainly in certain extremes, war may have been the only choice, like certainly in the situation in World War II, in particular that one, and especially in Europe. That may have been the only choice in that very extreme version at the rise of fascism, of the Third Reich. But in most other cases, there are other ways to react in nonviolent manners. And so we can look at that to see if those options are still possible. that the potential is still there. So it's looking at our reactions and looking at ourselves in the mirror and seeing what's really, really important here for us. To look, certainly to trust our hearts, to trust our souls of what we're moving into. So we have now completed this cycle. I was just giving you, this is just a major preview of Mars and Aries. I will be doing more of this in the future. This is episode 6 and a special episode. My next episode will come in the second week of July. I'm going to be on a short road trip in Southern Oregon and in a little town in Northern California called Willow Creek to do an intro class. And it's just going to be something informal and obviously paying attention to certain social distancing considerations and you know, helping for people to protect themselves when necessary, and to just help out in any way that I can and be of means of service. So stay healthy. I encourage you all to look up in the sky to connect with these planets. Right now, they're visible in the very early morning. And if you stay up right now past midnight, you can see them. But as we get into the summer, oh, they're going to be highly visible in the evening time and much, much easier to see for most people. And even in urban areas, Mars will be easily visible. Saturn, questionably, Jupiter for sure, highly visible, and Venus, of course, in the morning sky. Mercury, just to give you a note, Mercury station retrograde today, and in the sign of Cancer at the 14-degree area. This is just adding to what we're experiencing in this, all these, what traditional astrologers call the, you know, cardinal signs, and what I connect with in shamanic astrology, householder or culture bearer signs. Essentially, they're the ones that kind of connect with the hinges of the solstice points and the equinox points. So Mercury is involving itself there. So there's some additional areas where we want to connect with our heart space and kind of look backwards and connect and be more creative in our approaches, and maybe expand our vision of what family means, what humanity means, as a one tribe rather than being too closed up and tribal in a clannish in a way that's closed to other peoples, other cultures, other nations. So that's all I've got for you today, and I wish you well, and look up and see the stars and dream well. Thank you.